city called Stavropol. Oops, okay, got it. From the city of Stavropol, and from a farming family. His father was a member of the Communist Party, and Gorbachev lived through some very traumatic episodes in Soviet history. Just as a young boy, his grandfather was arrested, accused of being a Trotskyist, which was an appellation given to a wide number of people who were or were not, more often, opposing the Soviet regime. And also, this southern town of Russia was captured by the Germans in the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviet people and the Russians today call it. So this was part of his formative experience, and also having been quite a great student, he was able to attend Moscow State University, the premier higher education institution in the Soviet Union. And you could say that Gorbachev belonged to a group of young Soviets called the Thaw Generation, individuals who wanted to move beyond the rigid Stalinist petrification and to try to introduce some new life into Soviet literature. He joined the party. He moved up. He went back to his hometown of Stavropol and became the party chief there. His specialty was agriculture. And there he'd met a woman who was very capable, became his most trusted advisor, Raisa, and they served as a great team. Although, of course, he was the one who was occupying this post as he moved up. Now, Gorbachev was selected as the general secretary, which was the head of the party apparat in the Soviet Union. That meant that he was the premier leader. And almost immediately, he started to implement a program that he started to think about earlier. He called this perestroika, restructuring of not just the Soviet planned economy, I should add also in this slide, of Soviet society in general. And as a way of trying to facilitate, to move this program of reform forward, he introduced this idea also known as glasnost, which in Russian is openness or transparency. And the idea was to try to mobilize the public, the grassroots of Soviet society, to try to overcome these economic problems that confronted the country, and also to try to democratize the country, trying to introduce new initiatives from below and to overcome the rigid control of the Soviet Communist Party. So these were very, very revolutionary ideas at the time. One of his first programs that he implemented was the introduction of cooperatives. And these were collectively owned small businesses that were not beholden to the state planned economy, but rather could generate profit to be distributed equally among its owners and operators. And this is something, a concept that actually had been introduced by Lenin in the early 1920s to try to revitalize the Soviet economy after the horrible revolution and civil war years. You can see here on this newspaper, Gorbachev was directly hearkening back to Lenin's legacy. Actually, Gorbachev was inspired directly by Lenin and was an avid Leninist, at least in the early stage of his political career. Let's see. Oh, sorry. So the reforms really captured the imagination of the Soviet people in the first years that they were implemented. Gorbachev had called for more direct contact with the people, a more direct language of truth, he called it, and attempting to introduce what he called socialist democracy. One of Gorbachev's great breakthroughs, and probably what he's known the most of, and I'm sure some of our other participants will be mentioning this, were his actions in ending the Cold War. And quite often, US President Ronald Reagan is giving credit for this, but it was actually Gorbachev who agreed to nuclear arms reduction a number of times when confronted with Reagan's Star Wars anti-missile defense program Rather than building up Soviet armaments in response, he negotiated decreases in nuclear arms. And this opened the door to the end of the Cold War. Also, too, withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, a war that had lasted for 10 years, that had just absorbed horrible amounts of resources, lives, and caused social problems in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's reforms inspired people beyond his borders, beyond the borders of the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe. A number of revolutions occurred there. Gorbachev took them in stride. In fact, appeared calling for reforms in these different places. He was probably surprised with the falling of the Berlin Wall and the fact that East Germany now would be unified with the West. But the end of the Cold War was a major accomplishment, just an epical type of accomplishment that you have to give Gorbachev credit for achieving. There were many problems, though, that emerged in reform, and well, even a simple reform like the Soviet anti-alcohol campaign, the attempt to overcome the scourge of Soviet Russian society that caused so many ills, child abuse, wife beating, absenteeism at work. It was very hard to reform Soviet society. There were terrible backlashes. Just the fact that moonshine increased, organized crime, took advantage of this prohibition. Also, too, the fact that a lot of revenues that had come into the state coffers because of the monopoly over alcoholic beverages, it really made it more difficult for Gorbachev. Also, too, the problems that emerged after the Chernobyl disaster that he had to deal with, to try to make the country responsive to this horrible disaster. Just the idea, too, of glasnost really helped to undermine, ironically, Gorbachev's program. The fact that a lot of individuals took the initiative to criticize some of the horrible abuses that had occurred under Stalin in Soviet society. And the war in Afghanistan, groups of mothers criticized it, formed organizations outside of official hierarchies. So a type of civil society that was developing started to criticize Gorbachev's reform in saying that his idea of the democratization that was being run by the Communist Party was inherently undemocratic for that very reason. And so criticizing the Stalinist past, he actually opened up a new democratic type of organ called the Congress of People's Deputies, which selected him as president. This was the first election, the first free election in the Soviet Union. And unfortunately, I think it would be the last, if I'm not mistaken. But unfortunately, the pre-existing problems of the economy were just overwhelming. And Gorbachev's attempt to kind of tinker with the planned economy weren't able to overcome the deep-seated problems that existed in the supply chains, and the fact that much was being siphoned off, that it was unproductive. There was lack of incentives. And so it became really something that undermined his program as well. The fact that the economy was failing, that workers were going on strike. There was the perception that authority was being undermined, and that chaos was starting to gain the upper hand. And so finally, in 1991, with increased numbers of nationalist revolts, the nationalist uprisings that occurred in the different republics of the Soviet Union led to the actual breakup of the country. In these countries, the Soviet Communist Party had been weakened by Gorbachev's reforms that had broken its monopoly. And with ethnic problems breaking out among different regions of the country, Gorbachev had to move back and forth between reform and trying to reestablish order. And a group of hardliners actually kidnapped Gorbachev, took him hostage, and tried to overthrow the government, to revert to some type of Stalinist law and order regime. Gorbachev was able to escape, but his credibility, his legitimacy as leader of the country had suffered a fatal blow. And so it was left to the leaders of the Union republics, the leaders of Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Russia itself, of course. Here you see Boris Yeltsin, the main initiator of this dissolution. Yeltsin had earlier banned the Communist Party within the boundaries of the Russian Republic. So Gorbachev's country disintegrated, and he resigned, but the country had already come to an end by December 25th of 1991. And so the Soviet Union finally had broken up, Russia being the main entity that's left over. But I guess the question I'll leave my fellow panelists and also you in the audience with is, why did this reform fail? If it seemed so promising, it seemed that it engaged so many people. Was it something that was a system that was inherently unreformable? Or was there a chance to try to salvage something, especially now since we see the resurgence of nationalism within Russia and its revival with Putin and others, and especially with the war in Ukraine? It does seem connected with this very directly. So this is a question that we'll all have to address. But that's all that I have. So thank you for the opportunity. That's all.
Thank you so much, Professor Panic. We are going to turn this Dead Hour dialogue next, our panelist, to Chris Endy, who's going to give us a little bit more information and develop really, a perspective on the Cold War and his legacy as well. So let's hold our questions until the end. And then I would like the audience to engage with, every one of the panelists as well. Is that okay with everybody? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Let me know. Good job. Okay, Professor Endy, it's on. You're ready.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Dennis. And so I want to kind of pick up a theme that that Tim was talking about kind of lost opportunities for reform, but shift away from Russia and the Soviet republics to the question of nuclear weapons, and talk a bit about Gorbachev and the legacy for nuclear weapons. And here too, we could ask, like, was there a legitimate chance for successful reform? Because I think the one thing we can take from Gorbachev and nuclear weapons is the power of dreaming big. And this is something where the United States and the Soviet Union and really the world came tantalizingly close to seriously getting rid of nuclear weapons in the 1980s, in large part because of Gorbachev, also because of his US counterpart, Ronald Reagan. And, that moment passed, and I'll get into the details, but we're living in a world with dangerous nuclear weapons. And this is a world also of nuclear proliferation, where in the years after Gorbachev, we've now seen countries like Pakistan and India developing nuclear weapons, North Korea developing nuclear weapons. The world is becoming a more dangerous place. And maybe if things had turned out differently with Reagan and Gorbachev, we could have ended up with a more peaceful, more secure world. So I think with so for Gorbachev, his road to limiting nuclear weapons, comes out of those same pressures that Dr. Painich was talking about, with the need for economic reform. And nuclear weapons and nuclear arsenals are expensive. The Soviets are spending a substantial share of their economic wealth on the military. So Gorbachev is looking for ways to prioritize domestic and civil economic prosperity. And so he comes into power in 1985, and then he meets his counterpart, Ronald Reagan, who has sort of unconventional views on nuclear weapons in the United States. And as far as we can tell, these are pretty sincere, Reagan's views are pretty sincere. I still can't figure out myself as a historian how sincere Gorbachev was in his dislike of nuclear weapons, because obviously, he's dealing with a weak hand with a crumbling Soviet empire. But Reagan seems pretty sincere with nuclear weapons, and maybe Gorbachev is. And I would look forward to hearing from some of the other panelists in terms of how to judge the sincerity of Gorbachev on this. But they start saying some pretty radical things, and things that would be almost unfathomable to hear today from from world leaders. So they get together, for instance, Reagan and Gorbachev get together in Geneva in 1985. And I'm going to use, instead of a PowerPoint, I'm going to put some things in the chat. But in Geneva in 1945, they issue a statement saying a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And compare that to the kind of nuclear saber rattling that we have over Ukraine today. And so this is, the two of them are thinking in broad terms about perhaps getting rid of nuclear weapons. The next year, in 1986, Gorbachev sends what's called an abolition letter, sometimes by some historians. And this is January of 1986. And here Gorbachev proposes something extremely bold. And here I'll put the details into the chat, but he comes up with a 3-stage program for getting rid of nuclear weapons. And so the first stage, and I'll give you a link for this in a second, but the first stage is a 50% reduction in strategic nuclear weapons. Strategic nuclear weapons are basically long-range nuclear weapons, the ones that can go from a continent to another continent. So 50% reduction in 5 to 8 years. Then they would get rid of medium-range nuclear weapons in Europe. These were very controversial at the time. In Germany, for instance, the medium-range missiles were extremely controversial because those were the missiles that were in Germany, and then the ones that would be sent to the Soviet Union. So Germans felt like they would be those missiles would be the ones destroyed in a Soviet strike. So they were putting the security of Europeans at risk. So then the idea would be to get rid of all medium-range nuclear weapons. And then the second stage is even more profound, and that would be to start rolling back nuclear proliferation. So once the Americans and the Soviets agree to this, then we can get the British, the French, and the Chinese to also make moves towards getting rid of nuclear weapons. And then after 9 years, in 1995, start getting rid of the other ones. So this is the proposal that Gorbachev gives first in kind of the secret letter to the United States. Then he makes this public as well, and this is and Reagan's response. And we can see kind of Reagan working this through with his advisors is, yeah, let's go for it. Like, this is promising. And so there's this then moment of sense of big things could happen, where both American and Soviet leadership are thinking that we could imagine a world without nuclear weapons. So they get together. Like, here's some sample dialogue of Reagan and Gorbachev talking with each other. Just look at this. Like, it's amazing. It would be fine with me if we eliminated all nuclear weapons. Gorbachev, we can do that. Let's eliminate them. Like, we can do this. Like this. So to me, this is dreaming big. This is kind of taking. It's a mixture of. I think with Gorbachev, a mixture of national security concerns. Dealing with a weak hand, but I think there's also an element of kind of a moral purpose here. So this is the big dream. Obviously, we still have strategic and intermediate and tactical nuclear weapons. We've got all variety of nuclear weapons. So this dream did not work. In part, I think the main reason you could argue that it came down to sort of really on some level small scale bickering over how to deal with missile defense systems. So the United States was developing a missile defense system, sometimes called Star Wars. And this concerned Gorbachev because he knew that the Soviets wouldn't be able to keep up with the missile defense technology. Gorbachev knew that the missile defense technology was nowhere close to working, but he figured that eventually, maybe in decades in the future, it might start working, and the Soviets would be at a disadvantage for this. So they kind of came back on what kind of research was allowed on missile defense, and they went back and forth on what types of research would be allowed on missile defense. Gorbachev wanted a slightly stricter definition of what kind of research would be prohibited on missile defense. In particular, he wanted the word laboratory taken out of an agreement. The United States insisted that they wanted the word laboratory in an agreement. They wanted to still be able to do lab laboratory research on this. And it kind of went back and forth, and then the momentum failed, and this agreement and this enthusiasm never happened. But I feel like there's still, like, despite the failure here, just the fact that leaders were able to dream like this, that they were able to come up with a bold position, I think is something we're missing in our world today when it comes to kind of creative new visions for how the world should operate. And so this total nuclear abolition never happened, but at the same time, there were still other successes that came from it. So with all this momentum, the two sides were able to create the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty in 1991. There was a ban on intermediate range missiles, so kind of withdrawing intermediate range missiles from places like Germany. So even though the big goal didn't succeed, lots of smaller goals did happen from this. And I think I would say we need to go back to this kind of big dreaming. And maybe it takes a dying empire like Gorbachev's to have this dreaming, like, because it's the dream of somebody losing his poker hand, is maybe how I would see it. So of course he's going to talk big. But we have to start somehow, and we have to kind of create spaces for this dreaming. So I'll stop here as we think about and I'd love to hear more about what people think about, Gorbachev and the sincerity of his anti-nuclear views.
Thank you so much, Professor Endy. Did you want our audience to answer right now, or should we move on to Choi and her, Dr. Chatterjee and her presentation?
Up to you, Dr. Dennett.
Okay.
We can keep going with, because Tim gave us questions, so we can hold off to the end.
Okay, that's fine. I got them written down anyway. So Dr. Chatterjee, let's start, finish up with you, and then we can open up the Zoom room for audience questions and discussion.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dawn, for organizing it. It's so very kind of you. And I love the brilliant title you have, Dead Hour Dialogues. And
we're trademarking that at Cal State LA. That's ours. So
yeah, I'm trying to share screen. And then I also want to thank Professor Paynick. It's so wonderful to have another Soviet historian in the department. It was excellent introduction. And Dr. Endy always makes us think, as long as I've known him, something provocative, something new. And thank you to the students. It's so lovely to see you. And I know there's some faculty members here also. So I just have 2 slides. And I want to talk about empire and nationalism, because in a weird way, let me see if I can play from the current slide. Yeah, this is a little better. Because for Russia, those two are interrelated. There is no Russian nation and then Russian empire. The Russian nation is always a justification for Russian empire. And I will bring Gorbachev into this context. And we've heard about this wonderful man, all the many good things that he wanted to do. But when he died, no one showed up for his funeral. Putin didn't go. None of the top echelon of the Russian administration showed up. And actually, very few people showed up for his funeral. And that really made me think is, why do they hate Gorbachev? And I was in Russia in September of 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. I was there through that year when we went from 3% inflation to 3,000% inflation, where there was really hunger in a country that always prided itself on its middle class status. And I saw the complete collapse of a civilization which nothing had really prepared me for what I was seeing. It took me many, many years to understand. I kept going back to Russia subsequently after that. And then the decade of the 1990s, which was celebrated in the West as this immense victory and the collapse of the Soviet Union, was an unalloyed disaster in Russia. And I know from friends in different provinces in Central Asia, in Ukraine, the Baltics did the transition very beautifully. But everywhere else, people in Moldova, for example, it's still in transition. I'll just stop over there. The collapse of the economy and the rough transition to capitalism was part of it, right? Because in a country where everyone had a job, as they said, we pretend to work and you pretend to pay us. But everyone had a job, everyone had subsidized housing, everyone had subsidized transportation, culture, education, Medicare. It wasn't of the greatest standard, but there was a stability to that middle classness. Suddenly, everything disappeared. I had Russian friends tell me that we are not wired to subsist in the private market, right? We just don't even know what to do. So suddenly a very, very dear friend of mine who was a geologist, she suddenly started creating goods from India. And then oftentimes I go to visit her and there was these shady gangsters in her house. I saw some guns there once and I asked her what's going on. And she said, Joy, don't be naive. You don't become a trader without some muscle. And we left it at that. And then subsequently in the 2000s, this friend of mine became a very high-end importer of Italian goods. But in the 1990s, people did what they did to survive. It was a terrible time. The other thing that we saw after 1991 was the rise of the first set of oligarchs, who then Putin was going to bring to heel and have his own oligarchs, the rise of extensive crime syndicates that spanned Russia and spilled over into the neighboring countries. And all this was funded by the privatization of state property. What was called as shock therapy, there was no therapy, there was only the shock, right? As all my friends used to like to joke. And so euphemistically, all these giant Soviet-owned enterprises were auctioned off. The workers were all given shares, but inside there was always an oligarch who made the deal, bought the shares. So, if the Russian worker got 10 rubles a share, then of course the oligarch hold all the shares. So what we have is the biggest transfer of state property to private hands. In 1917, we saw the biggest transfer of private property to state hands. In 1991, we saw the reverse. And suddenly you had these billionaires in Russia who owned unimagined wealth, but they did that because the Kremlin was too weak to control them. And this weakness of the Kremlin, which we liked very much in the West, the Russians thought it was just simply awful what was happening. And I remember, it was in 97, it was not common to see mafia bosses right through Moscow with armed guards with much bigger guns and Kalashnikovs in tow. And then by the 2009, 2010, you rarely saw that in Moscow or in the provinces. So for a lot of people in the Soviet Union, 1991 was a complete disaster. And you need somebody to blame it on, and Gorbachev became that person. So let me go to the next slide. Now, part of the problem is, of course, that Gorbachev believed when he talked about the common European home. He was a westward-looking man. He thought Russia's real identity was in Europe. George Bush was really rattled in 1991 when the Soviet Union, the collapse was imminent, and he wanted the first George Bush. And there's good evidence that he wanted to slow it down. He didn't want it to collapse overnight because he was thinking about the implications. Now, Gorbachev and his crew really believed that there would be some kind of Marshall Plan for the transition from Soviet Union to Russia, right? And they really believed that, especially Germany had been so extremely generous with the incorporation of Eastern Europe, and certain, of course, the Baltic states also. He was not naive in believing that, but however, it became very clear that Clinton had no desire to have any kind of Marshall Plan for Russia. And a lot of the American experts who traveled to Russia, I saw at the time, were very scornful of this primitive backward country, and that they really needed to learn and how to get along in this new world. And at the same time, globalization was in full spate, and Russia was just seen as, some of my friends, what is Russia? It's just a giant gas station. That's all Russia's ever produced, right? So there was it became, and Tim knows this, right? It became okay in our field from fearing and respecting a Soviet Union to suddenly thinking of Russia as international basket case, right, Tim? Would that be fair to sum it up? Now, so if Gorbachev had delivered the bacon, right, if he had brought in billions of dollars in transition money, he would have been remembered differently, right? Instead, what they took away from this is Gorbachev was a fool to believe in Western promises, and the West is never going to help us. We have to do everything on our own. And this is really the beginning of Putin's thinking. And 2001 was another pivotal moment when Putin reached out to the West. And then by 2003, 2004, you have this realization that Russia needs to look for friends elsewhere. I won't go too deep into the mystical origins of the Russian Empire. So Putin says this over and over again, right? That Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. And that's where Russian history started. It started during the era of the Kievan Rus, when there was no Russia, but there was idea of Russia. So the notion that Ukraine and Belarus could ever be separate from Russia is something that Russians have a very hard time understanding. Now, Russian national identity is tied to imperialism. It's not that there is a Russian nation and then there is an empire out there, right? So in England, there is a Britain, there's a United Kingdom, and then India was its colony far away. There was no question of assimilation or incorporation. It was just a matter of strategic exploitation. And Russia is a contiguous empire, and the Russian Empire moved from modern-day Ukraine, Kievan Rus, to Moscow, right? So it moved and actually moved north and moved to Moscow. And then from Moscow, it spread out south and east, right? Siberia down south, and then Central Asia is incorporated at the end in the late 19th century. The Russians have always, if you start reading what Putin's saying, paying attention 2003, 2004, he is basing his idea of Russia against Gorbachev, right? So if Gorbachev destroyed Russia, led to its humiliation, destroyed the economy, impoverished an entire nation, then Putin is the gatherer of the lands, right? Which is a word from Russian history. I won't go into the past. So Putin is the not Gorbachev, right? If Gorbachev left the country in ruins, Putin is determined to restore the dignity, the status, the identity of Russia. And the way he did it, of course, was in the early 2000s. Gas prices are very high. He didn't have to do much, but what he did is he brought the oligarchs and the crime syndicates under the control of Moscow. So it's not that they went away, different set of oligarchs, different set of criminals, but they were under Kremlin's control. And that was better than when you had a period in the 1990s where these thugs were trying to gun each other down in the main cities. Putin has, he gave several important foreign policy speeches, and it's amazing that he always manages to bring up Gorbachev, right? Because what he's reminding Russians is that you remember the Gorbachev era, right? And so I might be boring, I might be staid, I might be oppressive, you might not like me, but do you really want to go back to the time of troubles, which is a loaded concept in Russian history? There was a time when the Polish Empire tried to even wipe out Russia, take over the throne in Muscovy. So he refers to the 1990s as a time of troubles. And so it's not so much a vote for Putin, it is a vote it's a vote against Gorbachev and Gorbachev's naive ideas about a common home and bringing capitalism and Western style values to Russia. Now, I just want to end with, I heard a talk by a Russian scholar of China, and it was very interesting. I heard it years ago and it stayed in my mind. And then I had a colleague of mine write an article on this for a couple of volumes I was editing, in which the Chinese also really dislike Gorbachev. And so much of what Xi Jinping talks about is also that, look what Gorbachev did. Once you let loose control, then 1990s is what is not to do, right? And so the Chinese Communist Party decided, even if we liberalize, even if we allow the private market, we are never going to lose control, because if you lose control, then you wind up with the basket case that was Russia in the 1990s. And so I'm going to end here. We can go on to questions, but I've given you a dramatically opposite point of view from Russia. And I think it's always fun when we have more than one opinion in a room. And now you guys have 3 distinct opinions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. It's always a pleasure to hear from you and your insight. Let's open up our audience. We only have until about 4 o'clock, to stay within the Dead Hour dialogue kind of theme and everything. So please put your questions in chat or just ask one of our panelists. That's fine as well. Unmute yourself and go ahead. Let's get a little dialogue going. This is where we wait uncomfortably for about 30 seconds. We all know the drill and everything. I see some of my students don't have me call their names, but yes, please put your questions in chat or just ask either Professors Endy, Chatterjee, or Painick. They're thinking really hard, I'm sure.
I had a question.
Thank you, Julian.
Hi, panelists. It's nice to see everybody. So can we say, and this is a very rough sum up, that really the economic crisis that took place at this time could be the reasons why reform failed, why the nuclear kind of arms agreements fell apart, and then we have continued instability. It seems like the economic crisis was one of the largest concerns. And what does that say about today with the world economic crisis kind of starting and playing out due to multiple factors like the war in Ukraine, as well as the pandemic and, a change in globalization trends? I just wanted to see what the thoughts of the panelists are. Are there any parallels we can kind of draw between the decades of the 90s to kind of some of the things that are going on right now?
Great question, Jewel. And Tim and Chris, do you want to go?
Oh, Chris, I don't know. Did you want to go first?
You can go, Tim.
Okay, yeah. I was thinking that really neoliberalism was a strong movement at this time, and trying to deregulate economies, trying to privatize, all of this. I mean, it really came out in the 90s, but it was part of Reagan's program as well, Reaganomics. It was something that was part of a debt crisis in Latin America and elsewhere in the world. And I don't think we've solved those problems. I think that they're just kind of coming back in a different form. The problems with COVID, of course, have exacerbated that. But the fact that the Russia depends on oil a great extent too, right? I mean, that's something that puts their economy at risk if the price of oil collapses like it did under Gorbachev. So there's some parallels and definitely some issues that could play out in a similar ways to the 80s and 90s, I think.
Thank you.
And I think that economics has an unpredictable effect on politics and diplomacy. I think the constant is that it matters, but we can't always tell how it's going to matter. So I think, Gorbachev was so eager to pursue bold diplomatic and kind of nuclear goals, in part because, it was a country that was losing access to foreign currency. And so they needed to, they got to a point where, Gorbachev was asking the West Germans to pay for the Soviet troops occupying East Germany. So this is, one of the, so that's how bad things were in the Soviet Union, that they were asking, one set of Germans to pay for Soviet troops occupying the other set of Germans. The economics really put a limit on what the Soviets could do. And, as I was thinking about this with Gorbachev and the decline of the Soviet empire, I keep thinking about the US empire. And, we know that empires don't last forever, right? There's never been an empire that's lasted forever. So at some point, the US empire is going to go through some changes. And I feel like, the US empire for now is strong, but it depends a lot on the power of the US dollar. The reason why we can keep going into debt and keep interest rates relatively low, which they still are, even if they've recently risen, is because the dollar is the world's de facto currency, the world's reserve currency. And if that were to change, then suddenly US leaders are going to start acting a lot like Gorbachev. They're going to be going to other countries and saying, okay, we can no longer afford imports anymore. Because if the dollar, we underestimate how crucial the dollar's international strength is to our way of life and to our geopolitics. Economic crises could lead to diplomatic compromise and willingness to rethink priorities. It could also lead to backlash and striking out. So I don't think we know I don't think we can predict what's going to happen, but I'm keeping an eye on the strength of the dollar and the rise of cryptocurrency as an alternative. I'm thinking that in the next few decades, we might see some major shifts there. Whether that's going to make the world safer or more dangerous, that's going to depend on what leaders we have in power and what grassroots movements are pressuring them.
Thank you so much, Professor Endy. We have a couple questions in chat. Christian has asked the panel, didn't the Brezhnev doctrine start to bring the Soviet Union to its knees? And then we have Esmeralda, and then Amatina is going to ask us a question as well. So let's talk about Christian's question about Brezhnev and the doctrine.
Okay. If I could just go back to Jolin's question about the economic crisis, I'm just thinking about a few things that are going on right now, right? Soaring food prices and fertilizer prices, that is really, really shaking countries in North Africa and the Middle East. We're just seeing the horrendous devaluation of the British pound, which is now way below the dollar. We are seeing almost 700% increase in energy costs in Europe. And really, people are angry with Germany for taking care of their own industries. And then we are just seeing OPEC. OPEC just decided to cut their oil production to help Russia, right? So there are all kinds of signs flashing everywhere. And I sometimes think Russia's role in history is to project the coming world order. In 1917, they made it very clear that the European empires were going to die soon. In 1991, their collapse allowed globalization and the neoliberal world order. And I think right now the Russian-Ukrainian war is also pointing to a new, I think, a multipolar world order, where I think US policy will have to navigate that. We are so used for 30 years of being unchallenged king. That's going to take us a little bit of time. And Jorge, your question in chat, it was terrible.
Yeah.
I can't even tell you, people were little old ladies on the pavements selling, like a christening mug, old shoes. I mean, I can't even tell you the heartbreaking things people, and these were people who were just middle class a few weeks ago. And then I remember when hyperinflation reached 3,000%. And I used to get a little stipend. My university paid me to be there, but they used to give me a stipend, my Russian host. And at one point, when I calculated, the stipend was $2 when I translated it. And I felt like, oh, this is what Nazi Germany, pre-Nazi Germany must have felt like. It was truly horrendous. And I just marveled at the ability of my Russian and many non-Russian friends, I say Russian by default, I should say Soviet, who managed to make do, right? Growing their vegetables, scanning, freezing, putting it in salt, all the incredibly smart ways that they got through that terrible decade.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chatterjee. Esmeralda asked a question too that was in chat. Is there any possibility of communication or cooperation with any political leaders minus Putin? Echoing on what Professor Endy discussed with Reagan and Gorbachev.
Just to jump in, I mean, that's a great question. I don't see it now with current leadership, but I think also, we shouldn't wait for leaders like Reagan and Gorbachev to come around, at least, not that they're role models in these regards, but at least when it came to talking big on nuclear weapons, I think there's something admirable there. But they're also products of their time. So Reagan and Gorbachev are coming at a time when there's massive grassroots protest in Western Europe against nuclear weapons. The Catholic Church is also campaigning against nuclear weapons. So you were getting kind of moral pressure from, non-state organizations, from grassroots organizations. So I think that if we can see more of that in the world, like the strength of a peace movement, I think could help create the kind of space and encourage leaders and reward leaders. Because, leaders are still going to be cynical. I think they generally want to stay in power first and foremost. So the grassroots pressures that they face are going to determine how they pivot to stay in power. So that's the, don't get mad, organize answer. I think we have to create the leaders we want to see.
Thank you so much for saying that, Dr. Endy. Appreciate that a lot. Any other questions? I think Tim was going to talk to Christian a little bit more about his questions, but do we have anything from the audience? Tina, you can ask too. It's not a problem.
Oh, okay.
Am I pronouncing your name right? I apologize if I'm not.
This is Afshin, Mateen.
Oh, Afshin! Oh man, I thought it was a student-ary thing. You're just playing games with me in my office. I see what it is.
Show my face. So
okay, Dr. Mateen, please, you have the floor.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I wanted our students to ask questions first. My question, first of all, I want to thank all three presenters. Really, I'm not just saying this, but from all three of you, there's important points to learn, to take away. But I want to ask a very broad question, and it's also personal because I'm old enough to have lived through the 1980s as a fairly young person, but I was, interested in politics, observing these great changes that were taking place. And I was someone who was coming from a left, but we never thought, or that faction of the left that I was from, that the Soviet Union was an example to follow. We saw it as a failed or a negation of like the ideal socialist society. And when that system failed, or when Gorbachev was trying to carry out his reforms, there was a faint hope for a third alternative. If the transition of the Soviet Union would not be a collapse and turning into a kind of a miserable copy of the American empire, which is exactly what happened, because when it failed, then it was like the American model, and it's globally triumphant, and that was a moment of extreme myopia. That was like completely bad for the whole world. But there was a hope that maybe the Soviet Union could transition to a third way, something of take the best of. I know this is extremely utopian, but Professor Endy mentioned big thinking, and this was really big thinking on a grand scale. If you could have the best of the liberal welfare state as that developed in Europe, to some extent in the US, and whatever positive you might have gleaned from the Soviet experiment, it wasn't all negative. There were some positive things in it too. But that didn't happen. And so we had to live through the horrible 1990s, that this great moment of, of course, that was completely wrong. And to the present, we have this notion that the way things are is somehow natural. We have something called the economy, and the economy functions, and you have to raise productivity to solve political problems. I just wanted to put that on the table, that moment of great expectation also turned into a great disappointment for people on the left who had hoped that something else, a third alternative, maybe a hybrid of the best of all possible worlds, might emerge. And it's a complicated question. I wasn't optimistic then, and I don't think this was, but that too I think that should be part of the conversation, because from where we're sitting now, the world has become, I'm not saying everything that happened was a reversal, but we're living, say, for example, from the point of view of nuclear weapons that Professor Endy mentioned, this is a much more dangerous world. And we're much closer to a disaster destroying entire everything, not just human civilization, but everything on this planet. And I don't think the performance of like the disparity of wealth and all the problems that everyone knows in some ways have become much worse. So I just kind of wanted to go back and put that idea on the table. So sorry, it was a little bit rambling, but it was kind of like a time travel journey to those that kind of moment of missed opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mateen. You're so funny. Anybody want to respond? We can kind of close out in a couple minutes. Professors Andy or Panik or Chatterjee.
I think that's a great sentiment there, Afshin. I think that, it seemed like it was possible there, a type of democratic socialism that might work. And, democratizing the rigid Soviet system, it had many, positive attributes, but it had, just like a rigid top-down type of control. And it gave socialism a bad name, of course. So to be able to reform it, I think it was, something that the world aspired to see Gorbachev, many in the world aspired to see Gorbachev succeed. Yeah, you might be right, Chris, when you said that Gorbachev wasn't completely serious about nuclear weapons, but he did make his proposal in 1986, which was relatively early on, and maybe he was forced later into cave, by the early 90s, but and by then the dream was over, right? I mean, by then, he didn't have anyone supporting on the left or the right to help him. So for a very brief time, it was possible, perhaps.
Thank you so much. Dr. Chatterjee or Professor Andy, did you want to close out the session with any final thoughts, some insight, where we go from here?
Chris, why don't you go? And I'll say something at the end if you have time.
Oh, well, I was just going to encourage people to watch the infamous 1997 Pizza Hut commercial. I feel like we can't talk about Gorbachev and his legacy without this dismal failure here. So I will put the I'll put the link into the chat. It's actually, but one thing I learned, in preparation for this panel is that he insisted that he would not be seen eating the pizza on screen, and instead he had a grandchild show up and eat the pizza. So I think we can see here sort of a man struggling for dignity. He was, hard up for, like many of these post-Soviet citizens, hard up for money. His pension got destroyed, and so he was desperate for cash. Pizza Hut was desperate for some sort of major breakthrough. So this is I think it's a sad commentary, but also I think it shows again the power of the marketplace. That seems to be a theme that's running through this, is that, these dreams that Afshin were talking about democratic socialism, they got, I think, in the case I know best, the case of Germany, with East Germany, there were a lot of people assuming a third way after the collapse of the German Communist Party. There'd be a democratic socialism, but economic dependency kind of dashed those dreams of an autonomous democratic socialist East Germany. So I think these market forces are really powerful, and all those people from the Warsaw Pact countries just got sloshed up in those market forces, including Gorbachev. But he didn't put the pizza in his mouth, and somehow that meant something to him somehow.
Thank you, Professor Andy. Dr. Chatterjee.
Yeah, I just want to say Afshin raises something really important, and I always felt that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the best thing that happened for socialism, because socialism was never supposed to be mired in imperialism. It was supposed to be decentralized, local communities. It had its roots in anarchism. I never quite bought into the Stalinist model of the state-sponsored socialism. And I continue to be hopeful that, socialism has to be local in order to work. And so I think the Soviet Union giving up socialism might have been the best gift to the left.
Thank you so much. The audience, let's thank our panelists, Doctors Panik, Andy, and Chatterjee, for this, I think, an insightful conversation for our Dead Hour Dialogue. I want you guys to stay tuned because we have another event coming up soon, hopefully with Afshin and the events in Iran, with the attacks on student protesters and faculty as well. But once again, I want to thank the History Department for, again, sustaining this Dead Hour Dialogue. It's so insightful for our students. Thank you, students, for showing up for this too. I see a lot of my students right here in the chat. So anyway, I will let everybody go. This is going to be recorded. It is going to be on our website soon, just for a reference too. So thank you, everybody that showed up, and I'm sending you on your way with good energy. I'll see you soon. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Dawn.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you, Jorge. You're so nice. I made you A right there. So thank you, Julian. Thank you. It's nice to see everybody.
Thanks, Don. Great job moderating.
Oh my goodness, you should have seen me panicking
Thanks,
with
Don.
no camera. I didn't have it.
I don't